So, welcome back to our next Judges study. We're in Judges 16. If you've been keeping up, we've been studying about Samson the last couple of times. And now we come to probably one of the most famous stories in Judges, well known at least, and that is about Samson and Delilah. So, chapter 16 and verse 1, Samson goes down to Gaza, which is the Philistine city, and there he finds a prostitute and he goes in to her. Uh, Not something Samson should have been doing, obviously, but then again, Samson has already shown a habit of his relationships with women being things that ought not to be. First with this choice of wife, and then now we have him going to a prostitute. So the people of the city of Gaza in verse 2 find out that Samson is there, and they surround the place. They set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. And they kept quiet all night long, saying, "Let's wait until the light of morning and then we'll kill him." So this is their plan. They're going to wait till morning. They're watching to make sure that he doesn't get out of town. But Samson only stayed there till midnight. Verse 3 says, "At midnight he arose and he took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two posts and pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill in front of Hebron." Now, you think about a guy who can take the city gates and pick them up and carry them by himself. We know Samson was a strong man for sure. So then we find out a little bit more about this woman, a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. Now, a lot of times people think that Delilah was the prostitute from verse 1, but that doesn't seem to be the case. This seems to be another person, another woman continuing his bad habits, another Philistine woman that he's chosen. Verse 5, the lords of the Philistines came to her and said to her, "Seduce him and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him so that we can bind him and humble him. And a we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So I don't know how many of these lords of the Philistines there were, but they're each promising to give her this large sum of money. And of course, she takes that. So she, in verse 6, begins to say to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength lies, and how you can be bound, and how one can subdue you." And so she just wanting to take advantage of this situation that she has with him, has him wrapped around her little finger so she can find out all this information about him. Well, Samson says, "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I'll become weak like any other man." And so that's exactly what they did. They brought up 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. And she had some men waiting in ambush in the inner chamber, and she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And of course, he snapped the bowstrings as a thread of flax snaps when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength wasn't known. Now he starts to get an attitude of, well, see, nothing can stop me because of this. And so then she says to him, "Oh, you mocked me. You told me lies. Please tell me the truth. How can you be bound?" And he says to her, "Well, if you bind me with new ropes that have never been used, then I'll become weak like any other man." So, of course, she does that. And again, she calls out, "The Philistines are upon you." And again, he snaps the ropes, and just like thread. In verse 13, again, Delilah says, "You're still mocking me. You've told me lies. Tell me how you can be bound." And so he says, "Well, if you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with the pin, then I'll become weak like any other man." So he's saying to her, "Okay, if you take these braids in my hair and you weave them in like on the loom, then I'm going to be weak." And so he notice he's getting closer to the truth here. But of course, I don't think he realizes that there actually is a truth. I don't know that Samson has really connected his obedience to the Nazirite vow with his strength. I don't know if he realizes that this is the case. So here we see then she tries that. Now, every time he tells her something, she tries it. And so you have to wonder what he's thinking, continuing to tell her. He needs to realize, of course, that she's foolish. Samson doesn't seem to have much wisdom when it comes to women, that's for sure. If we think about it, all of us probably have somebody among our friends and family who is that person that always makes those foolish mistakes and doesn't learn from their mistakes, keeps making those same decisions over and over again that get them into trouble. And if you don't know who that person is, then it's you. But you probably know that person, or maybe you've been told that you're that person among your friends and relatives. But Samson's that guy. He just never realized he won't get away from her. He needs to get away from her. She's causing all these problems, but instead, he just keeps telling her. So this time he says, weave the 7 locks of my hair. And so she does that, of course. She weaves them, and then she says, the Philistines are upon you. And of course, he jumps up just like before. Well, verse 15, she says, well, how can you even say that I love you when your heart's not with me? You've mocked me 3 times. You haven't told me where your great strength really lies. And so she keeps pressing him day after day and urging him until his soul was vexed to death. You ever had somebody vex you to death, or nearly to death? It can be that way sometimes with people. So he finally told her all his heart. He says, a razor has never come upon my head. I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me and I will become weak like any other man. Now, again, we're going to see in a minute, he does not think that this is really the source of his strength. He still thinks he's fooling her, but she has finally gotten the truth out of him. And it wasn't just the fact that his hair hadn't been cut, it was his keeping of that vow. And that's where the real true source of his strength was, that he was in that relationship with God because he was keeping this vow. But now he's told the vow, and of course, she realizes, oh, this sounds like the real deal right here. He's finally telling me everything. She tries one more time. She says, this time he's really told me everything. She calls the lords of the Philistines. They come up, they bring the money in their hands. She got him to fall asleep on her knees, and then she called a man to come and shave off the 7 locks of his head. And then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. Verse 20, she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep, and he said, or thought, I will go out as the other times and shake myself free. But he didn't realize the Lord had left him. And there was the key. The real source of his strength was the Lord. It wasn't his hair. It wasn't not eating grapes. It was that he had this relationship with the Lord. And so that's finally gone now. The Lord has left him. And so the Philistines seized him. They gouged out his eyes. They brought him to Gaza. They bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at the mill of the prison. The hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. And the lords of the Philistines gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. We don't know how much time passed between the time they shaved his head and shackled him and this time where they're having this celebration. But they're still really excited about having Samson. They've got the guy who had killed so many of them. And so verse 24 says, and when the people saw him, they praised their God, and they said, our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us. And when their hearts were merry, they said, call Samson that he may entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. And they made him stand between the pillars. So you've got this big building. It's got the pillars that are holding it up, and they've got him standing there between those 2 pillars. And Samson says to the young man who held him by his hand, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. Of course, they think nothing of it because his strength has been gone, so they don't think there's any danger there anyway. And so the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there. And on the roof, there were about 3,000 men and women. So they all looked on while Samson entertained. Then Samson called to the Lord. And he said, O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. One of Samson's biggest problems, as we see the problems in the book of Judges, Samson always seems to attack the Philistines out of vengeance for himself because they've wronged him in some way. Instead of being out to fight against them and destroy them because of God, it's always a selfish motivation. And here too, he wants, because of my 2 eyes, I want to be avenged. He's not concerned about the rest of Israel, really. And that's a very dangerous thing for someone who's supposed to be a leader, to be selfish like this. But God does grant him that strength. We see verse 29, Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against him, his right hand on one, his left hand on the other. And Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. So he pushes these 2 pillars that are holding this roof up that they're standing on, mocking him, and everything collapses and everyone there is killed, including him, of course. And verse 31 says, His brothers and his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. He had judged Israel for 20 years. And so here we have the end of Samson's life. And it's odd to me, sometimes that we choose, we look at Samson like this great hero and we tell the kids the story of Samson. And yet Samson really throughout his life, it's a life of selfishness and fulfilling his own desires. He rarely is actually going about doing what God wants him to do from the account that we have here. So he's not really much of a hero. He's not somebody that we should certainly ever want to imitate. But he had this great strength as long as he obeyed God in the Nazirite vow. But he gave that up and lost that. But he does get it back one more time. And God uses him to destroy the Philistines. But again, Samson, not the greatest of role models, certainly. And again, this is throughout the book of Judges. Uh, these judges, it's all downhill. Even the judges themselves are not always godly individuals. And so I hope that we can learn from Samson's the lesson of not making the same mistake over and over again, not being fooled, not allowing someone to talk us into doing things that are wrong or that God has told us not to do. He allows Delilah to fool him into giving up the secret of the Nazirite vow, and of course he loses his relationship with God over that, and it's only restored at the end of his life before he dies. I hope that you've enjoyed studying about this, and we'll continue on next time into chapter 17.